hope you're doing well. Today's video is on the MLK conspiracy. This is the third time I'm trying to upload this particular video. Hopefully I don't get no copyright strikes, and hopefully everything goes well with this one. I hope you guys enjoy it. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4th, 1968, an event that sent shockwaves reverberating around the world. A Baptist minister and founder of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, King had led the civil rights movement since the mid-1950s, using a combination of impassioned speeches and nonviolent protests to fight segregation and achieve significant civil rights advances for African Americans. His assassination led to an outpouring of anger among Black Americans, as well as a period of national mourning that helped speed the way for an equal housing bill that would be the last significant legislative achievement of the civil rights era. In the last years of his life, Dr. King faced mounting criticism from young African American activists who favored a more confrontational approach to seeking change. These young radicals struck closer to the ideals of the Black nationalist leader Malcolm X, himself assassinated in 1965, who had condemned King's advocacy of nonviolence as criminal in the face of the continuing repression suffered by African Americans. As a result of this opposition, King sought to widen his appeal beyond his own race, speaking out publicly against the Vietnam War and working to form a coalition of poor Americans, Black and white alike, to address such issues as poverty and unemployment. Did you know among the witnesses at King's assassination was Jesse Jackson, one of his closest aides? Ordained as a minister soon after King's death, Jackson went on to form Operation Push, People United to Save Humanity, and to run twice for U.S. President in 1984 and 1988. In the spring of 1968, while preparing for a planned march to Washington to lobby Congress on behalf of the poor, King and other SCLC members were called to Memphis, Tennessee, to support a sanitation workers' strike. On the night of April 3rd, King gave a speech at the Mason Temple Church in Memphis. In his speech, King seemed to foreshadow his own untimely passing, or at least to strike a particularly reflective note, ending with these now historic words: "I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land. And I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." In fact, King had already survived an assassination attempt in the shoe section of a Harlem department store on September 20th, 1958. The incident only affirmed his belief in nonviolence. At 6:05 the following day, King was standing on the second-floor balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, where he and his associates were staying, when a sniper's bullet struck him in the neck. He was rushed to a hospital where he was pronounced dead about an hour later, at the age of 39. Oh, wow. I'm 39. So, shock and distress over the news of King's death sparked rioting in more than 100 cities around the country, including burning and looting. Amid a wave of national mourning, President Lyndon B. Johnson urged Americans to reject the blind violence that had killed King, whom he called the apostle of nonviolence. He also called on Congress to speedily pass the civil rights legislation then entering the House of Representatives for debate, calling it a fitting legacy to King and his life's work. On April 11th, Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act, a major piece of civil rights legislation that prohibited discrimination concerning the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, religion, national origin, or sex. It is considered an important follow-up to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. On June 8th, authorities apprehended the suspect in King's murder, a small-time criminal named James Earl Ray, at London's Heathrow Airport. Witnesses had seen him running from a boarding house near the Lorraine Motel carrying a bundle. Prosecutors said he fired the fatal bullet from a bathroom in that building. Authorities found Ray's fingerprints on the rifle used to kill King, a scope, and a pair of binoculars. On March 10, 1969, Ray pleaded guilty to King's murder and was sentenced to 99 years in prison. No testimony was heard in his trial. Shortly afterwards, however, Ray recanted his confession, claiming he was the victim of a conspiracy. The House Select Committee on Assassinations, who also investigated the assassination of JFK, maintained that Ray's shot killed King. Ray later found sympathy in an unlikely place. Members of King's family, including his son Dexter, who publicly met with Ray in 1977 and began arguing for a reopening of his case. Though the U.S. government conducted several investigations into the trial, each time confirming Ray's guilt as the sole assassin, controversy still surrounds the assassination. At the time of Ray's death in 1998, King's widow, Coretta Scott King, who in the weeks after her husband's death had courageously continued the campaign to aid the striking Memphis sanitation workers and carried on his mission of social change through nonviolent means, publicly lamented that America will never have the benefit of Mr. Ray's trial, which would have produced new revelations about the assassination, as well as established the facts concerning Mr. Ray's innocence. Though black and white people alike mourned King's passing, the killing in some ways served to widen the rift between black and white Americans, as many black people saw King's assassination as a rejection of their vigorous pursuit of equality through the nonviolent resistance he had championed. His murder, like the killing of Malcolm X in 1965, radicalized many moderate African American activists, fueling the growth of the Black Power movement and the Black Panther Party in the late 1960s and early 1970s. King has remained the most widely known African American leader of his era and the most public face of the civil rights movement, along with his most eloquent voice. A campaign to establish a national holiday in his honor began almost immediately after his death, and its proponents overcame significant opposition. Critics pointed to FBI surveillance files suggesting King's adultery and his influence by communists before President Ronald Reagan signed the King holiday bill into law in 1983. After the assassination, King's family did not trust the findings of the FBI, which had harassed the civil rights leader while he was alive. For some 50 years, the federal government has maintained that James Earl Ray was the gunman who assassinated King that day. But within Martin Luther King's family, there remains a persistent belief that Ray is innocent and was set up to take the fall. FBI investigators at the time traced the shot to a rooming house across the street, and witnesses directed them to a large bundle dropped on the sidewalk after the shooting. It contained a pair of binoculars, a newspaper with a story about King staying at the Lorraine Motel, and a .30-06 Remington Game Master that had fired one shot. All three bore the fingerprints of an escaped convict named James Earl Ray. Ray, a white supporter of segregationist George Wallace, was a career criminal who had been convicted at least 4 separate times for robbing a cafe, a taxi, a post office, and a grocery store. A year before, he'd escaped from Missouri State Penitentiary while serving a 20-year sentence and was on the lam at the time. King was shot. An international manhunt led to his capture in June 1968 at Heathrow Airport in London, where he was caught carrying 2 fake Canadian passports. Ray confessed to the crime on March 10, 1969, and received a 99-year prison sentence, which increased to a 100-year sentence after he briefly escaped in 1977. But within a few days of confessing, Ray began to claim his innocence, arguing that he had been set up by a man he knew only as Raoul. It was Raoul, Ray said, who had directed him to buy the gun and the binoculars and rent the room across the street from the motel. Ray said he wasn't in the room when King was shot, but he was unable to consistently explain where he had been or keep other important details in his story straight. Over several decades, federal investigators have routinely concluded that Raoul didn't exist. This doesn't mean that Ray couldn't have received assistance. Some people have trouble, for example, believing Ray had arranged his international escape all by himself, since he had a track record of getting caught for more minor crimes. When authorities caught him in London, he'd been planning to travel to Rhodesia, a former African state ruled by a white minority in present-day Zimbabwe. But even if Ray had help, the evidence strongly pointed to him pulling the trigger. Ray's fingerprints were the only ones found on the gun, and there were no witnesses who had seen him with Raoul during the 9 months they supposedly knew each other. Ray's description of Raoul also changed a few times. It's not clear when Coretta Scott King, widow of King, began to believe in Ray's innocence, but almost immediately after her husband's assassination, she suspected that the FBI, which had investigated the murder, was involved in it. There is abundant evidence of a major high-level conspiracy in the assassination of my husband, Martin Luther King, Jr., Coretta King said at a press conference in 1999, according to the King Center. It was a theory she maintained until her death in 2006 that has so far never been proven. Yet, given the way the Bureau had treated her and her family, her suspicion of the FBI and its conclusions about her husband's killer came from a very reasonable place, says John McMillan, a history professor at Georgia State University. During the 1950s and 60s, the FBI surveyed and harassed King, his family, and his associates. The Bureau wiretapped his phone and monitored his movements, taking advantage of times when he seemed particularly upset or depressed. In one instance, the FBI sent him a tape that allegedly contained audio of him having an affair. With it came a letter threatening King with public exposure if he didn't kill himself, and claiming that the sender had evidence of other affairs. They might not have been involved in the murder, McMillan observes of the FBI, but I wish people knew the really shameful things that they did. Indeed, a former agent from the FBI's field office in Atlanta said the Bureau's tracking of King was second only to the way they went after Jimmy Hoffa. In 1975, a group of former FBI agents called on Congress to investigate this harassment. That investigation declassified scores of memos detailing the Bureau's abusive behavior, but did not reveal any evidence that the FBI had formally plotted his death. Coretta King's specific belief in Ray's innocence is a little tougher to explain. The King family started to publicly voice the opinion in 1997. That year, King's son, Dexter Scott King, visited Ray in prison to draw attention to the family's push to appeal his case. Even after Ray died in 1998 from complications caused by hepatitis C, the family continued to assert there was, as Coretta King said in 1999, overwhelming evidence that identified someone else, not James Earl Ray, as the shooter, and that Mr. Ray was set up to take the blame. The King family's belief in Ray's innocence was partly influenced by the strange case of Lloyd Jowers, who'd owned the restaurant below Ray's rented room in Memphis. For the first 25 years after King's death, Jowers did not claim any involvement in the murder. But after HBO conducted a televised mock trial about the assassination in 1993, in which Ray gave his first public testimony and was found not guilty, Jowers declared that he'd been part of a conspiracy to kill King and that Ray had been set up to take the fall. The other people involved in this conspiracy, Jowers said, included Memphis police officers, a mafia member, and the infamous Raoul. These claims led King's estate to sue Jowers in 1999 for a symbolic $100 in a wrongful death civil action. During the 4-week trial in Memphis, a 12-person jury heard testimony from over 70 witnesses, but not Jowers, who didn't testify because there was no criminal charges at stake. The jury awarded the money to the estate, citing that King's assassination had likely been the result of a conspiracy that involved Jowers, not Ray, as well as others, including governmental agencies. The day after the trial ended, Coretta King held a press conference in Atlanta to praise the decision. "I wholeheartedly applaud the verdict of the jury, and I feel that justice has been well served in their deliberation," she said. The jury was clearly convinced by the extensive evidence that was presented during the trial that, in addition to Mr. Jowers, the conspiracy of the mafia, local, state, and federal government agencies were deeply involved in the assassination of my husband. It's important to note that this verdict was not a criminal conviction, as is sometimes erroneously implied when this case surfaces online. Between 1998 and 2000, the Department of Justice investigated Jowers' claims and the evidence in the civil trial and concluded that Jowers' claims weren't credible. Among the evidence was a recording of Jowers in which he suggested he was interested in fabricating his story for financial gain. So are there still remaining questions about how everything happened the day of King's assassination? As with most cases, the answer is yes. But among legal and historical scholars, there is a broad consensus that James Earl Ray, though he may not have been acted alone, is the gunman who shot Martin Luther King. Thank you for watching today's video. If you liked the video, please give me a thumbs up. And if you would like to see more videos like this, please subscribe. What paranormal or crime-related mystery would you like to see next? I hope you all have a great day.